So we've been talking about classifying triangles, and one type of triangle that we saw was called the isosceles triangle. Today we're going to talk even more about this type of triangle. So hopefully you guys remember that an isosceles triangle is one that has two congruent sides. I've drawn tick marks on this diagram here to show that those two sides are congruent and that it is an isosceles triangle. Now, we have a specific word we use for the two sides that are congruent in an isosceles triangle, and we call those legs. So this over here is a leg, and this right here is a leg. So if I'm naming those, the legs of my triangle are sides AB and AC. Now, the third side of my isosceles triangle, the one that's not congruent to anything, that is called the base. So the base of this triangle is side BC. That is not congruent to any of my other sides. Okay, now let's talk about the angles in an isosceles triangle. I have two angles here that have the base as one of their sides. Those are the angles that I'm highlighting in green. We call these base angles. So I would say that the base angles in this triangle are angle B and angle C. Now remember, I could name those with three letters, angle ABC and angle ACB, but in this case I can also only use one letter for these angles. Now, another way that we sometimes talk about our base angles is by saying that our base angle is opposite from one of the legs of our triangle. So let's look at angle B. I would say angle B is opposite my side AC. Okay? There's that word opposite. And what that means is it's farthest away from AC. It's not touching AC. AC is the side that's farthest away that's not touching my angle B, and that's how we'll use the term opposite. I would also do this for angle C, and I would say angle C, my base angle, is opposite from my side AB. The final angle in my triangle here is the one that is opposite from my base. It's formed by the two legs of my isosceles triangle. It's the one here that we would call the vertex angle that I highlighted in yellow. So here in this triangle we would call our vertex angle, angle A. Now that we have named all the different parts of our isosceles triangle, let's look at the next questions and first name the congruent sides. Well, we talked about this already. My congruent sides here are the ones with the tick marks on them. So I would say side AB is congruent to side AC. Now notice these are the same ones that we talked about when we looked for the legs of our isosceles triangle. The legs of our isosceles triangle are the ones that are congruent. Now what about congruent angles? In an isosceles triangle, it is my base angles that are congruent. So taking the base angles that I talked about earlier, I know that angle B is congruent to angle C. And I'm going to draw tick marks on my angles to show in my diagram that those are congruent. So now we have a lot of different ways that we can talk about our base angles. Base angles are the ones that are going to be congruent, like we just saw. They also, like I talked about earlier, they are the ones that are touching the base of my triangle. And they're also the ones that are opposite from the legs. These are all really important pieces to remember because we'll use each of these to solve some problems about isosceles triangles. Okay, let's do some examples here to use what we just learned. So number one, if RM and AR are congruent in triangle RAM, which angles are congruent? The best thing to do here is to start by drawing a picture. So I'm going to draw my triangle RAM, okay, and I'm going to label each of my angles. And then I'm going to draw tick marks to mark my congruent sides. I know that side RM is congruent to side AR. So that's those two sides right there. Now, the next thing I need to know is which angles are congruent. Well, if you remember, we talked about how our base angles are the ones that are congruent. So I need to decide which are my base angles. Well, my base angles are the ones that touch the base of my triangle, or they're the ones that are opposite from the legs, or opposite from my congruent sides. So if I look opposite from each of my congruent sides, I can see that my angle A and my angle M are going to be my base angles. Okay? So if angle A and angle M are my base angles, those are the ones that are congruent. So I can write angle A is congruent to angle M because I knew that those were my base angles. Okay, now let's look at number 2. I've got this triangle ABC here with my sides AC and BC being congruent. So I'm going to start right away. The first thing I'm going to do is draw tick marks on my diagram to show which ones are congruent. So I've got AC and BC. Okay? Now, if I know those two sides are congruent, I'm going to start by writing an equation for y, because one of those side lengths has my 4y on it. If I know that side BC and AC have to be congruent, all I need to do is set their lengths equal to each other, right? So I know that their lengths, AC, has to equal BC because they're congruent. And AC is 20, and BC is 4y. That is going to be an equation that I could solve to find y. Okay, now let's try to write an equation for x. Well, I know that I've got an expression for x in my angles, so I need to talk about my angles to find an equation for x. Now, we talked about how the base angles were congruent, but which angles in my triangle are going to be congruent? We need to figure out which ones it is. So our base angles are opposite from our congruent sides. So opposite from my side AC is my angle B, which I have labeled as 3x. And opposite from my side BC is my angle A. So these two are congruent, angle A and angle B. Now, since angle B is 3x, I also know that angle A has to be 3x. They are congruent, so I can just write in the same angle measure there. So now I've got angle A as 3x, angle B as 3x, and angle C as 70. The next thing I would want to do is say, well, now that I have the 3 angles in my triangle, I can add them all up to equal 180 degrees, because that is true of every single triangle. So for x, I can write 3x for angle A plus 3x for angle B plus 70 for angle C has to equal 180. That is the equation I would solve for x. The reason I was able to do that is because I figured out that my base angles were angle A and angle B, and I knew that they were congruent. And that is how I was able to find the measure for angle A. So as a little summary, when we're working with isosceles triangles and trying to solve equations or solve a problem, the first thing you want to do is draw a diagram and then mark anything you know that's congruent, whether it's maybe you have congruent sides, maybe you have congruent angles. Mark those on your diagram. And then really the second thing we want to do is find and mark any other sides or angles that are congruent. So my legs are congruent and my base angles are congruent. I need to find those and mark those as congruent as well, and then we can go from there.